This is GARIS Masculist MGTOW Flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 143, entitled Living in the MGTOW/Masculist Generated Population Crash. Description. This flyer portrays what life might be like during the MGTOW/Masculist generated population crash. It presents various attitudes from different groups as the population tumbles. Now the flyer itself, if I can find the bloody cursor. Living in the MGTOW/Masculist generated population crash. What will life be like a decade or two from now when everyone is conscious that the population is crashing due to the paternity strike of the MGTOW/Masculists? That is what this flyer attempts to portray. With 2/3 of young men under 35 in the US and Japan refusing to marry and have kids, it's only a question of time before the whole of society wakes up to the fact that men have gone on a paternity strike. How will society react? The longer the strike continues, the more alarmed society will become, because it obviously means that if it continues long enough, whole populations get wiped out. In fact, in less than a century. If you do the math, that is, with the young generation reproducing only 1/3 of its number over a century, that is 4 generations, that is 1/3 of 1/3 of 1/3 of 1/3, is about 1%. That is, the population is decimated. Well, 10 times worse than that. What attitudes will society take as the paternity strike continues? There'll probably be a slew of different attitudes towards the problem that I label and list here and then comment on them later. The Japanese man up attitude, the feminist blame men attitude, the MGTOW/Masculist men fair society attitude, the government tax the bachelors attitude, the gender politicians restructure society attitude. The Japanese man-up attitude. The herbivore men in Japan have been on strike against the traditional salaryman role for about a decade longer than the US MGTOW movement has existed. So the Japanese politicians have had longer to think about the effects. In Japan today, 2/3 of young men under 35 refuse to marry, refuse to have kids, and spend their money on themselves, living modestly, not spending much, and often having nothing to do with women. The Japanese parliament is so alarmed about the issue that it has even appointed a minister of population to try to persuade young Japanese men to be fathers. Unfortunately, since the Japanese are not known for their creativity, in brackets, scoring a standard deviation and a half below comparably developed cultures on creativity tests, this minister only made things worse by haranguing these young men to man up. That is, accept your male role of being a breadwinner of the family so that women can have babies, so that Japan will not die out. This was the last thing the Japanese herbivore men wanted to hear from their minister of population. These young men look at the traditional salaryman role of their fathers and are horrified. Their fathers work a typical 11-hour day, 3-hour commute time, hand over their salary to their fluffy wives, who gives him a modest allowance and then spends it on the house, the kids and herself. In Japan, the husbands overwork and the wives play tennis. The herbivore men are saying fuck that to the traditional salaryman role and are rebelling against it. They want women to pull their weight financially and not parasite on men. They reject the manslaver of the Japanese salaryman role and want nothing to do with it. I think the Japanese politicians need to be taught MGTOW/Masculist principles from Western literature to get ideas on how to solve their problem. See below for details in the section on the gender politicians' restructure society attitude. More of the same is obviously not the solution. The politicians need to really listen to what young Japanese men are saying and restructure their society, but that has not happened yet. The feminist blame men attitude. The feminists, being female, with their childlike, irresponsible minds, will blame men for everything, rather than take some of the blame for the masculist MGTOW paternity strike. They will say to the public, it's men who are causing the population to crash because they refuse to grow up and take responsibility for being fathers and pay for the creation of the next generation. The MGTOW/Masculists will, of course, dismiss this typical feminist reaction and claim that it is the feminists who have made the divorce courts toxic in the first place, so that millions of men avoid marriage and hence divorce and paternity like the plague. The MGTOW/Masculists will accuse the feminazis of being hypocrites in wanting equal rights for women but not equal obligations. That is, women should all become FIPs, financially independent persons, so that they do not financially massacre their ex-husbands/fathers in the divorce courts, taking the father's kids, his house, forcing him to make child payments and pay alimony to his fluffy ex-wife. The MGTOW/Masculists will hit back hard against the fluffy feminists, accusing them of hypocrisy. The MGTOW/Masculist men fair society attitude. The MGTOW/Masculists will be frequently on the broadcast media when the population crashes, explaining to the culture why men have gone on strike against marriage and paternity. They will tell society that we now live in a genocracy, where the men are treated as second-class citizens and are routinely financially massacred in the divorce courts. Roughly 1 married man in 4 gets financially massacred in a divorce court in the US, a massive injustice against men. The Masculists will tell the journalists that men want a paternity rejection right, so that men can reject an unwanted pregnancy, so that if the woman goes ahead with it, she has full legal financial responsibility for the kid. MGTOW/Masculists will push the gender politicians to search across the board for examples of gender injustice towards men, and then to men fair the gender laws, so that men are more prepared to be fathers again. The MGTOW/Masculists will make it very clear to the gender politicians that if the latter don't men fair the gender laws, then the MGTOW/Masculists are prepared to wipe out whole populations, thus forcing the gender politicians to give men what men need, that is, gender justice, that they today do not have. The government tax the bachelors attitude. The government will become alarmed at the population crash and will initiate many studies on the issue. Think tanks will recommend political measures to push men to have more kids. One of the most obvious of such measures will be the bachelor tax. If too many men refuse to marry, then bachelors will need to be taxed more heavily to make up for the lack of tax revenue compared to the past. But if the bachelor tax becomes too heavy, large numbers of bachelors will simply uproot themselves and move to another country, where the cost of living is much less and where no bachelor tax exists. There's a limit to what governments can do to push men to be fathers. Trying to reinforce conventional gender role attitudes will not work, because it's these attitudes that the MGTOW/Masculists are rebelling against in the first place. Governments will have to look at the problem with a fresh set of eyes, which they will have to get from the MGTOW/Masculists themselves. The gender politicians restructure society attitude. According to Jim Willey, my favourite YouTube commentator on the dollar crash, America's loss of the world's reserve currency, China's takeover of the US, etc., 2016 is proving... Now remember, I'm making this flyer in 2017. Anyway, 2016 is proving to be the year when the world finally says a big no to the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. Once that happens, the standard of living in the US will fall to third world levels, because the US has sent its manufacturing mainly to China, so has little capacity of its own. The dollar will become an ordinary domestic currency like any other nation's, so the US will only be able to import what it can afford from its exports, which won't be much. This crash in living standards will cause a rebellion against the hated Jewish bankster Frankus Satanus, who caused the problem, who will be sent to The Hague or simply pogromed. A civil war may result. The hated Jewish banksters have been preparing for this war, and so the casualty figure will probably be in the millions. But since Americans have more guns than people, the people will win. The hated Jewish banksters will flee or be butchered in an American pogrom. After that, the politicians will be thrown out, since they have been bribed by these Jewish banksters for a century, including the gender politicians, as part of the Jewish bankster policy of divide and conquer, by supporting the feminist movement to create conflict between the sexes, to deflect attention away from the hated Jewish bankster dictatorship of the US, and robbing Americans' taxes via the Fed and the IRS, which were both set up by the hated Jewish banksters in the same year. Once the US has been made Jewish bankster free, and the Fed, IRS, ADL, that's Anti-Defamation League, that's a Jewish organization that fights against critique against Jews, have been dismantled, Then a new batch of politicians will be elected. The gender politicians amongst them will be very conscious of the MGTOW/masculist arguments and will do their best to mend-fair the gender laws. Otherwise they know that there will be no America, because there will be no more Americans. They will make new divorce laws that will be fair to both sexes. When the fluffy feminists, in all their hypocrisy, fight against such men-fairing, the masculists will drown them with venomous claims of hypocrisy and will continue their marriage/paternity strike until men get gender justice. The gender politicians will throw out alimony. They will make custody of children joint by default. Divorcing couples will be encouraged to buy a cheap apartment near their house that the two parents alternate in. 1 week the father is with the kids in the house while the mother is in the apartment, and the following week they swap places. The para will be brought in. This will force all women to be FIPs. Gender politicians will reform society so that it becomes a FIP society, that's capital F, capital S, where all women are socialised and educated to be FIPs. Parents and schools will push young women to be FIPs and to get a FIP major education, that is math and the sciences, so that they can be FIPs as adults and not look around for some manslave in their 30s when they want to raise kids in a middle-class house. Primary school and high school teachers will be half and half, male and female, so that boys are not alienated by a large majority of female teachers, as is the case today. The media will be pushed to treat men fairly, removing its feminist gynocentric bias. Women will be taught that men are the superior sex at the top end of the scale, because that is the simple reality, as shown by science. Once all these men-fairing reforms have been brought in, men will start to be more willing to be fathers again. Nearly all women will be FIPs and will be socialised and taught to be responsible adults and not parasite and dump on males as feminists do today in their childlike fashion. Enormous social and moral pressure will be applied by the MGTOW/masculists on women to FIP up or rot on the shelf. The MGTOW/masculists will play a historic role in the creation of a new society, one that is much more men-fair than today's gender-unjust society regarding men. Things have to change, or MGTOW/masculists will continue to wipe out whole populations. Things have to change. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name de GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers. Now, by way of parenthesis or PS, some of you may notice my Chinese wife interrupted this flyer near the beginning. That's because I have left my black beans to burn on the stove, and I'm now to be berated by my shithead of a wife. Ciao.